What if the United States government manufactured physical evidence, actual crates of Soviet-made weapons, and planted them on a foreign nation's soil to justify overthrowing its democratically elected president? That's not speculation. That is exactly what declassified CIA documents reveal about a covert program codenamed Operation WASHTUB, a companion scheme to the infamous 1954 Guatemala coup that most history books have never mentioned. In the early 1950s, Guatemala was led by President Jacobo Árbenz, a reform-minded leader who had the audacity to redistribute unused land owned by the United Fruit Company, an American corporation with deep ties to the Eisenhower administration. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles both had financial connections to United Fruit, and they viewed Árbenz's agrarian reforms not as democracy in action, but as creeping communism in America's backyard. The CIA's primary response was Operation PBSUCCESS, the covert plan to overthrow Árbenz using a proxy army led by exiled Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas. But PBSUCCESS had a problem. It needed a public justification, a narrative that would make regime change look like self-defense rather than imperial overreach. That's where a far darker, far less discussed operation entered the picture, and its code name was WASHTUB. Operation WASHTUB was a CIA false flag operation designed to plant Soviet-made weapons along Guatemala's Pacific coast, creating the illusion that the Soviet Union was actively arming the Árbenz government for a communist takeover of Central America. Declassified CIA documents, many of them released through Freedom of Information Act requests and archived at the National Security Archive at George Washington University, reveal that the plan was developed in early 1954 by the CIA's Directorate of Plans. The scheme called for caches of Soviet-manufactured rifles, ammunition, and other military hardware to be secretly introduced into Guatemala, not by the Soviets, but by CIA operatives and assets. These weapons would then be conveniently discovered, either by Guatemalan opposition forces or by journalists tipped off at the right moment, providing what appeared to be irrefutable physical proof that Moscow had established a beachhead in the Western Hemisphere. The declassified CIA operational files describe the logistics in chilling bureaucratic detail: procurement channels for Soviet bloc arms, proposed planting sites, and even the media strategy for maximum impact once the weapons were found. The operational architecture of WASHTUB was overseen by many of the same CIA officers running PBSUCCESS. Frank Wisner, the head of the CIA's Office of Policy Coordination, and later the Directorate of Plans, was instrumental in greenlighting covert actions across Latin America. Tracy Barnes and E. Howard Hunt, yes, the same E. Howard Hunt, who would later become infamous for his role in the Watergate scandal, were key planners in the broader Guatemala operation. The CIA station in Guatemala City, working alongside assets in Honduras and Nicaragua, coordinated the logistical chain needed to move Soviet weapons planted in strategic locations. What the declassified CIA documents make clear is that this was not a rogue operation or a mid-level officer's fever dream. I mean, WASHTUB had institutional backing, budget allocation, and fit neatly into the Eisenhower administration's broader Cold War strategy of containment, even if containment meant fabricating the very threat you claimed to be containing. But the question that should trouble every student of history is this: if the threat was real, why did they need to manufacture the evidence? This is where the historical record becomes both fascinating and frustrating. Some researchers, including historians Nick Colather and Piero Glaieses, whose work drew on declassified CIA Guatemala files, suggest that elements of WASHTUB were partially executed. In May 1954, just weeks before the coup, the Swedish freighter Alfhem arrived in Guatemala carrying a shipment of Czechoslovak weapons, a real arms purchase that Árbenz had made after the United States pressured its allies to embargo weapon sales to Guatemala. The CIA seized on this genuine shipment as propaganda gold, but declassified documents indicate the agency also wanted supplementary evidence, fabricated caches that could be pointed to independently of the Alfhem delivery. Whether every planned washtub cache was physically placed remains debated, as some operational files are still redacted or withheld under national security exemptions even 7 decades later. What is not debated is the intent. The CIA Covert Operations Directorate designed, funded, and planned a program to plant false evidence on a sovereign nation's territory to manufacture a casus belli, and the coup itself, launched on June 18, 1954, succeeded. Árbenz fell, Castillo Armas took power, and Guatemala descended into decades of military dictatorship and civil war that would claim over 200,000 lives. Operation WASHTUB is not merely a historical curiosity. It represents a documented, declassified template for evidence fabrication by a democratic government against a sovereign nation. The 1954 Guatemala coup became a model the CIA would replicate and refine in Iran, the Congo, Chile, and beyond. When we examine later controversies, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the Iraq WMD debacle, allegations of staged provocations, and countless other theaters, the shadow of WASHTUB looms large, not as conspiracy theory, but as documented institutional precedent. The declassified CIA documents don't just expose a single false flag operation. They reveal a bureaucratic willingness to fabricate reality when reality fails to justify policy. Every redacted page that remains classified is a reminder that the full story of what was done in Guatemala and in America's name may still not be fully told. And perhaps the most unsettling question of all isn't what the CIA did in 1954. It's what they learned they could get away with. If this story disturbed you, subscribe and hit the bell. Because next week, we're pulling back the curtain on another declassified operation that most people have never heard of. One that makes WASHTUB look like a dress rehearsal. You won't want to miss it.